Hello everybody and welcome to day 6. Today we're going to go over skewers, which are another very common tactical motif, and we're going to keep it pretty basic. The challenge with skewers is pretty much just spotting them, and just like all basic tactical motifs, you'd be surprised how often stronger players miss such tactics, especially in blitz games. But spotting them definitely takes practice. So, for example, in this position, it's white to move, and I'll just give you a second if you want to pause the video. Okay, so in this position, we can see, if we go through our thought process, that there's quite a few checks with the queen. We have some pawn moves, and it looks like the queen is threatening to come in and attack our king as well, but these knights are pretty much out of play for now. And you should also notice a material imbalance. Black has an extra knight into the game for a pawn, but if we're going to look at the various checks, we can see that white has a check here to win this knight back, because the king would have to go here or here. But you should also investigate every single check, because, for tactics, we're looking for checks, captures, and threats. So first, what you want to do is you want to look for the checks. And we pretty much just have two. We have here and here. Now you can see that if we bring the queen here, it hits the knight. The king can come over, but you should notice these kinds of features with the king and the queen on the same diagonal. Now, when you notice these kinds of things, it should set off kind of a spider sense, I guess you could call it, in your mind, and you could take advantage of that and win the queen. Okay, so he wins the knight back, but then there's another skewer, queen hitting the knight and the pawn. So he wins another pawn, and this pawn will fall pretty quickly as well. So at this point, he's won 2 pawns and a queen, and it's easily winning. So we'll move on to position 1. In position 1, it is white to move, so pause the video and try to solve it for yourself. Okay, so in this position, if we go through the 4-part thought process, it's quite simple. We could see, first off, that black doesn't really have any concrete threats, as his queen's kind of out of play. It doesn't really have any moves. For example, the king blocks it. The king also blocks the rook, and the rook's kind of out of play. And the king blocks the bishop. So there's really no threats for black. So for white, we could see we have multiple checks as well as captures. We can take here, we can check here, we can even check here, and we can check here, we can check here. So there's just a lot of options. So this is the difficult part when you're learning tactics, is trying to figure out what's the most important. Well, this is why you need to have a system. Because if you have a system, then you won't miss anything. And the more you practice it, the faster it goes. So in these kinds of positions, of course, you should notice these features. As I mentioned in the previous position, the king is on the diagonal. So unless you just notice it automatically, which a lot of strong players will, they'll notice the check here, which wins the queen. If you didn't notice it, how would you find it? And the answer to that is, especially in this position, the knight is pretty much out of play, and you need to evaluate that black is basically up a rook. So we need to either win a lot of material or checkmate the king in order to win. And if we can't do that, then we're lost. So we can see that if we check here, the king moves, and we win our rook back. So that's a good move. We should remember it. If we check here, the king has to move, and we win our bishop back, but we're down an exchange. So we should remember that, and we can discount queen to c2. If we check here, queen to b4, it doesn't really lead to anything. So we can see that if we check here, the king moves and we win the queen. So that's actually winning. So what you're doing is you're finding all the options first, which is step 2, all the candidates, and then you're calculating and basically figuring out and discounting moves. So as you go, you discount moves that work or don't work and you remember it. And then in step 3, you figure out the evaluation and decide on your move. Now step 4 is your last chance, a blunder check, to make sure that you didn't miss something and that the move you decided doesn't lead to a loss. So we'd evaluate this position, queen to g2, and figure out what the forcing replies are. Well, since it's a check, it's the most forcing. And so the black king has to move or interpose, and because of that, we can easily evaluate that it's winning. Alright, moving on to position 2. Position 2 is white to move, and you can pause your video now. Alright, so in this position, we can see that we're down in exchange. Black is threatening to take the queen, but again, the king is on the same diagonal as a piece. And so we should always evaluate all the checks, captures, and threats, and we can easily discount candidate moves as there's really no candidate moves to the bishop, the dark square bishop, although we need to be worried that the queen's blocking it off and that tactics such as trapping the bishop are possible in a move or two. The light square bishop doesn't really have any threats. I mean, we can bring the bishop here, but the queen would just take it. We can also bring the bishop here, but that doesn't really accomplish anything. So pretty much the only check we have is queen to h3, and we should definitely evaluate that. So if we go queen to h3, we can see that it's hitting the king and the rook, and because of the dark square bishop, the king can't move back to protect the rook. Now, normally the queen would be able to interpose, but because the light square bishop is hitting there, for example, the queen goes here, we would just take the queen. So the king has to move, and we win a rook. And so this also demonstrates the power of having the bishop pair. Now, when you have the bishop pair, especially when they're centralized, which they're not the best centralized here, but they're on the right squares, you cover all of the squares on the board, the light squares and the dark squares. And because of that, a lot of tactics can arise. Alright, moving on to position 3. In position 3, it is white to move, and you can pause your video now. Okay, so in this position, I really like this position first off, because it's very simple, but I know I've missed, and I've seen a lot of very strong players miss these types of tactics. And I'm not sure why it's so difficult sometimes, but sometimes the rank, you just miss that pieces are in line. So we could see, first off, that black's threatening the pawn. The knight can take the bishop. But otherwise, black is quite passive with these rooks here and the bishop just sitting on the 8th rank. So that allows white to have way more active pieces. And of course, you should notice features like an unprotected knight sitting here, although the queen's protecting it. But because the queen and the knight are on the same rank, we are able to skewer. And now this is where it gets interesting. So black could simply take the pawn, yeah, and we could simply take the knight, and this is where it gets a little computerish, but the bishop can come out here and basically ruin our pawn structure. And so in order to prevent that, we can keep threatening the black queen and preventing this pin that happens at the end of the line. So instead of just taking the knight, which we will eventually do, the computer actually suggests knight to e4. And now if the queen goes back, we still chase the queen further back. And so it's these kind of variations that you can learn a lot from the computer when you're analyzing tactics. you can learn a lot about, well, improving your strategic understanding of activity. You can see here the reason that all these moves happened was because white was able to completely make the queen passive. And now, at the end of the line, you can see it's actually much better. We've won a piece completely scot-free, our pawn structure is completely intact, and the queen's sitting over here on h6 completely passive. Whereas if we just went for the kind of human line, then we'd have to either move our rook and then allow something like this, which isn't too bad, but it's those kinds of things that you can learn a lot from computers. So just try that in the future, and we're going to move on to position 4. Position 4 is white to move, and you can pause your video now. Okay, so in this position, it's the exact same idea as position 3. Pretty much, the only threatening move other than, well, c4 is bringing the rook up and skewering the queen and the bishop. And there's really no complicated line because there's no pins or anything. Of course, these rooks are sitting here completely passive. And so white just simply won a piece scot-free. Now this is a little easier to notice other than the complete rank skewer as in the last position. But this kind of formation with 2 squares apart, queen here, with 2 squares apart, you'll see a lot in games, and it's a good one to memorize. So, moving on to position 5. In position 5, it is black to move, and you can pause the video now. Okay, so in this position, it looks like white definitely has an advantage, but of course, the layout of the pieces can lead to tactical complications. So in this position, we need to evaluate what white's threatening first. And, well, it looks like white's going to take this pawn here, either with the queen, most likely, or with the bishop, as well as threats of bringing his passed pawn in. And so there's really nothing we can do to protect this pawn. And really, we need to find some tactical complication that can win material, because if we can't do that, we're just simply lost, and that's the evaluation. So once we start looking for our moves, we need to look at all the checks, even if they look ridiculous. For example, we have the check here, we have the check here, so we also have the check here. And so once you start noticing these things, from previous tactical practice, you'll start to be able to put it together into a combination. And we can see that the check from the pawn doesn't really lead to anything. The king would just simply take it. Bishop takes bishop, doesn't really lead to anything, neither does rook to b8, checking the king. The king could just simply escape. So we could see that if we check here, that it's actually forcing white to take, because if he doesn't, for example here, if the king just moves, then we'll win the queen. And so that's the first step, is figuring out forcing moves. So we know that if we check knight to c6, white is forced to take. Now if he takes, we need to be able to visualize that this check now works rook to b8, because there's no interposition other than here, just giving away a bishop, which white wouldn't do, because the check would still, or the skewer would still be in effect. And so the king is forced to move, and now we're basically up in exchange. It was a quick turnaround. Alright, so in this position, you could see that in order to deconstruct it, you need to look for every single option. And it's pretty much going through that process is how you'll find the specific continuation of a combination. Alright guys, thanks for watching day 6, part 6 of 28 Days to Better Chess Tactics. We went through skewers, Let me know what you think about this lesson, whether it's the perfect length or whether it's too long or even too short. Just let me know what you think. I'm trying to strike a balance between teaching everything that I know, as well as keeping it succinct and educational, as well as entertaining, moving it along at a good rate. So just let me know what you think. We'll get through all the 28 days, 28 parts. Subscribe if you want to follow along in the future. So again, thanks for watching and have a good day.